Morning. I had earlier the week before, I had finished whatever devotional reading plan I had been doing on the YouVersion Bible app. I was looking for a new little devotional plan to go through on the YouVersion Bible app, and I ran across this little devotional plan about anxiety, 5-day little plan, and it was excellent. I would highly recommend it. And for me, I went through that and didn't really feel like I had been struggling with anxiety lately, but just thought, hey, this would be good for me to do this, and went through it, and it was really good for me to go through that little devotional plan. It was helpful for me because, like many of you, I'm sure, we often wrestle with anxiety, worry, fear, because of all sorts of things. Because truthfully, we are living in a time of great uncertainty and anxiety. Like, I'm sure that everyone in the room over the past few years, you've probably sensed some degree, some measure of anxiety or worry. Seems like the latest things we're worrying about are things like, hey, what's inflation going to do? How will a recession affect my family? How am I going to afford gas in the next month or the next day? Will our young family be able to purchase a home in this crazy housing market? And then, oh my goodness, what is the trajectory of our deeply divided political culture? What's that going to look like in the coming days and years? Hey, if we're honest, we have ample reason to be anxious and worried. But instead of following Paul's advice to not be anxious about anything and pray about everything, we often do the exact opposite, don't we? We worry about everything, and we often pray about nothing. Now, here's a question. Why should we bring to God our anxiety and our worries? Why should we bring those things to God? Well, there's a simple answer. It can be a complex problem, but there's a simple answer. Our God is a good provider. He's a good provider. In fact, we discover in Genesis chapter 22 that God is Jehovah Jireh, which means the Lord will provide. The Lord will provide. Now listen, we do not need to be ashamed of anxiety or worry, because we're gonna deal with some of that on this side of eternity. We're not alone in those struggles. However, I must say that as the people of God, we don't have to constantly live in a state of anxiety or fear or worry either, because our God will provide. He's a provider. On that note, welcome again to Connections Church. So this summer, we're working our way through the book of Genesis, and we're in the middle of this series on the book of Genesis. Today, we're going to look at the story of Abraham's most difficult day, the day that God calls Abraham in the Old Testament to sacrifice his son Isaac. Now, if anybody had ample reason to be anxious or worried and fearful, it was Abraham, for sure. But throughout this story of God testing Abraham, what we see is the provision of God. And so that leads me to the big question for today. Here it is. How does God provide? How does God provide? Of course, we know God provides in many ways. And I want to be clear as well that anxiety and worry are oftentimes complex struggles. And so I'm not intending to trivialize anxiety and give it a simple answer today. But I do know that God's provision is a foundational place for us to go looking for a solution to our anxiety, to go looking for help when we find ourselves wrestling with worry and anxiety. The main scripture is Genesis 22, verses 1 through 14. Let me give you some quick context before we dive into the passage. Abraham, from the Old Testament, is the great patriarch of the Jewish faith and the Christian faith, for that matter. Eventually, the long-awaited Messiah, Jesus Christ, comes from the family line of Abraham. So Abraham's story is critical if you want to understand the Old Testament and the New Testament. There's a lot of content in the New Testament that points back to Abraham as well. Now, what we find is that throughout the book of Genesis, the Lord brings Abraham through the school of faith. In each story of Abraham in the book of Genesis, we discover that the Lord is teaching Abraham about himself. He's teaching Abraham about faith. In Genesis 22, the Lord is testing Abraham. Really, he's teaching Abraham about total consecration. He's teaching Abraham to fully trust in God's promises and in God's provision. Now, as part of this teaching, God tells Abraham to go sacrifice his precious son, Isaac. Like on a literal altar, sacrifice his son, Isaac. Now, if you remember, Isaac, he is the son that God miraculously gave to Abraham, who was like 100, and Sarah, who was in her 90s. I mean, God miraculously allowed them to have a child in their very old age. Isaac is the son of the promise. Isaac is the son through whom God will bless the whole world. But Abraham trusts God. And Abraham prepares to sacrifice Isaac on an altar, which I cannot fathom as a father. But just in the nick of time, God stops the sacrifice and provides an animal to be sacrificed in place of Isaac. Now, as a side note here, we should understand that human sacrifice was actually, unfortunately, a common practice among pagan religions in this time period. Like as a form of worship, there were certain religions that would actually sacrifice children to God on a real altar. Absolutely awful in every way. And what we learn from this story, along with other passages in the Old Testament, is that the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, is absolutely against, he is condemning human sacrifice of all kind for his people. God's against that. That is a side note. But here, what we learn in this story is that God is developing the faith of Abraham with a very surprising and unprecedented test of faith. We don't understand it exactly, and I guarantee you Abraham didn't quite understand it either. So how does God provide? Let me share with you 3 principles of God's provision. Certainly these are not the only principles of provision, and these aren't the only things we learn from this passage, but these are 3 principles of provision I want to share with you today. The first is this: progression over regression. Progression over regression. You see, our God is a good provider. And our God is a good provider. He provides opportunities for us to progress in our faith. He wants to develop our faith so that we can progress into deeper degrees of trust in Him. Let's dive into the text, verses 1 through 3. Let's look at how God develops Abraham and Isaac's faith. It says this: sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on the mountain I will show you." Early the next morning, Abraham got up, loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. So what we find here is that the Lord asks Abraham to do the unthinkable, to sacrifice his beloved son, the most precious thing to Abraham. Abraham doesn't argue with God, doesn't seem to hesitate at all. He gets up the next morning and he goes about obeying what God has told him to do. Verses 4 and 5 say this. On the third day, Abraham looked up. They were traveling. On the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship and we will come back to you." Now, this is really crucial for us to see here. There are three, I'm not a Hebrew expert by any stretch at all, but there are three first-person plural verbs in verse 5. In effect, Abraham says, we will go up to that mountain for the sacrifice. We, meaning him and his son Isaac, we will worship. He may not know it yet, but he's going to be worshiped up to God. And we will return. Isn't that interesting? In other words, Abraham seems to be fully expecting to sacrifice his son, but on the other hand, he's fully expecting to return to camp with Isaac alive. Next, Isaac asks his father Abraham, "Hey, Dad, where's the animal for the sacrifice?" You know, animal sacrifice was a regular thing in that day. They would have been used to animal sacrifices, and Isaac knew, hey, we normally have an animal with us, like a sheep or something to sacrifice to the Lord. Well, there's no animal this time. You can sort of begin to imagine Isaac is maybe realizing that something is wrong. Abraham replies to his son and says this, Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the two of them went on together. Abraham seems to maintain faith that God is still going to hold true to his word, and God's going to bless the world through his son Isaac. He's ready to do what God has told him to do, sacrifice his son. But he's expecting God to somehow provide a solution miraculously. Now, if we jump into the New Testament, fast forward a few thousand years, jump into Hebrews chapter 11, we get a glimpse into Abraham's faith. Hebrews 11:19 says this, Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead. And so, in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. And writer of Hebrews, a couple verses before, we know he is clearly talking about this specific instance. So according to Hebrews, Abraham trusted that God could raise Isaac from the dead. Abraham knew that God miraculously gave him and Sarah a child in their very old age. And so Abraham sort of reasoned, well, hey, if he did that miracle, he can do another miracle and he can raise Isaac from the dead. So what does all of this tell us? Okay, we should be careful not to read too much into the details than what we actually have in front of us. But I think we see here a significant progression in Abraham's faith. God seems to be using this test that we don't quite understand to develop Abraham's faith. God, as the provider, he pushes us and he pushes Abraham to grow, to develop, to progress in faith. Several weeks ago, my 9-year-old daughter, Maddie, had a piano recital. It was at another local church here in town, and so we went over to this church for this piano recital. And toward the end of this recital, I started noticing that as each student finished their song on the piano, you could sort of see the relief in their faces when they were done with their song. And so in this church, there were like 2 rows up front, and all the piano students were sitting in those 2 rows up front. We were sitting, I think, in the 3rd row, right behind all these piano students. And so each student would get up, they'd play their song, and then they'd get up in front of the crowd, they'd bow, everybody would clap, and then they'd make their way back to their seat. And almost every single student, after they bowed and their song is over and people are clapping, you could see and you could hear the relief in each one of them. There was just a, oh, and they go back to, oh, I'm so glad that's done and over with. What a relief. You see, these piano students, at least I think most of them, didn't really enjoy this test of the piano recital. But their teacher and their parents know that that sort of test it's uncomfortable, it's not very fun for the student, but it's absolutely crucial for their development. Now imagine with me for a moment, imagine this situation with Abraham and Isaac. Imagine what the trip home must have been like. The test is over. God provided a ram to be sacrificed in place of Isaac. They discover, okay, God never wanted him to actually sacrifice and go Isaac and go through with it. And now they're on their way home. Test is over. Can you imagine the relief that both of them must have been experiencing? I'll tell you what, I bet the trip home was a lot more fun than the trip there. Just think of how transformative this lesson must have been for Abraham as well as the young adult Isaac. Our God is a good provider. Amen. Now, I don't believe God causes every bad thing to happen. Don't believe that at all. Sometimes bad stuff just happens in the fallen world in which we live. But I'll tell you what, our God, through his providence and sovereignty, is able to use all kinds of uncomfortable, unconventional, unprecedented situations for our development and our growth. And the thing is, as humans, we are very prone to always look for the easy way out. But God does not want us to regress. He wants us to progress in our faith. And sometimes progress, most of the time progress, involves some difficulty and pressure and pain and uncertainty and that sort of thing. Now, certainly this story is another of many lessons from Abraham's life of obedience and faith. But there's a powerful lesson here of development and progression. Simple question I want to just leave out there for us today. Here it is. Stop asking, how do I get out of this? Start asking, what does God want me to get out of this? Two very different perspectives, right? That's challenging. How does God provide? Well, first thing, progression over regression. Secondly, consecration over reservation. Consecration over reservation. Now, the idea of consecration is giving up ourselves to God, while reservation is sort of like withholding parts of my life from God. Now, I know it might seem a little counterintuitive, because in our world, you know, when it comes to like money in particular, we know that saving money is a good thing when it comes to economics, right? And it's a good thing for Christians as well. We should save money. It's wise. But in God's economy, the more I give away of myself, the more the Lord seems to provide. Like God's math is just different than our math, always. Let's take a look at verses 9 through 13. This next part of the story, it says this. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar, arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket, he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over, took the ram, and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. There's a lot we can learn from this story, but let's stick to just some of the real basics that we learn from this story. Okay, so first, Abraham sure seems to be fully prepared to kill his son Isaac on that altar, just as God had told him. We have the luxury of reading the story 3,000 or 4,000 years after it happened. The guy was, he was there, and he didn't have a manual in front of him like we do, right? Sure seems like he was ready to go through with it. And Abraham, according to the writer of Hebrews, Abraham trusted that God would provide, even if that meant raising Isaac from the dead after the fact. He wasn't sure how he was going to provide, but Abraham seems to be fully convinced that God's going to provide, and Isaac is still going to become many nations. Secondly, let's think about Isaac. Isaac was willing to allow his father Abraham to sacrifice him up on that altar. Now, we don't have all the details, okay? Very little details, actually. But there's a couple things we do know. We do know that Abraham is super old at this point. Now, you might think you're super old, but Abraham's like around 125 years old at this point in his life. Not exactly, in the strength of his life, right? We also know that Isaac is old enough to talk, and more importantly, he's old enough to carry the wood up on top of that mountain instead of his dad. So most scholars believe that Isaac is at least in his 20s at this point in his life. And so what that means is that in both Abraham as well as Isaac, we see a spirit of consecration rather than reservation. I'm going to give it all away to God rather than withholding it from God, even when I don't understand. I promise you they didn't understand. Commentator Matthew Henry says it this way: God, by his providence, calls us to part with an Isaac sometimes. And we must do it with cheerful submission to his holy will. Friends, that'll preach right there. Amen. So let me ask you, as for the Christians in the room, you love Jesus, you're following Jesus, let me just ask you to think about this. What is God calling you to give back to him in worship? Now, share with you something from my own story, and my story, my journey of my story of like stepping out in faith pales in comparison to Abraham's story of stepping out in faith, for sure. But 2.5 years ago, when my wife Aubrey and I were really discerning whether or not we were going to move to Billings, Montana to start what would become Connections Church, I struggled. If I'm honest with you, I struggled to trust in God in that season. I mean, we had plenty of reasons to hold off and play it safe. Plenty of reasons. We didn't have to move. And I'll tell you what, my wife, she is amazing in every way. And she had such a strong faith in that season. I believe stronger than my faith in that season, because I would kind of waver in that season. Gosh, should we really do this? Is God really calling us? There's a global pandemic, that sort of thing going on. And she would remind me often, hey, if God has called us, he's going to provide. And so we began to remind each other of that. Now, think about your own story. Many of you have a similar type of story where you knew God was calling you to do something. You knew you had to be faithful in this area of your life. but there was some uncertainty. And it's hard to step out in faith when we are uncertain of what it's going to look like. It's hard. But God is calling us as his people to consecrate all that we are and all that we have to him, even when we're uncertain, maybe especially when we are uncertain. So how can I go about consecrating my life to God? Here's a couple just simple thoughts quickly. Read his word, do what it says. Read his word, do what it says. That takes a lot of faith, my friends. Secondly, listen for his voice and seek discernment with wise, godly people. Third, resist comparing your journey to other travelers. Have you ever noticed, this is a side note, you're just going to get this for free. This is extra today. Have you ever noticed how Abraham's story is so unique? And you could say the same thing for Moses, David, all the heroes of the faith. All of them. All their stories are so unique. And it's interesting to me how, fast forward to Moses, this other just giant of the faith in the Old Testament. And Moses doesn't compare his story back to Abraham. In fact, God works in Moses' life light years differently than Abraham's life. And yet, what do we spend most of our time doing? We compare our journey to the journey of others. Sometimes in our pride, we feel really good about how good we are because, at least we're better than that guy. Most of the time, though, we feel pretty terrible about ourselves because we think, oh gosh, I'm still struggling with that thing. I'm still dealing with this again. My buddy isn't dealing with it the same way. Don't compare yourself. Don't compare your journey to other travelers. Lastly, watch God do more when you give more. Now, that's not a giving gimmick at all. I'm not even really talking about money. I just mean like giving yourself up to God in faith, consecrating yourself up to God. Okay, God, wherever you want to send me, I'll go. Whatever you want me to do, however you want me to leverage my life for you and your kingdom, I will be faithful to do. And it's amazing when you give more, God just seems to do more and show up in bigger and bigger ways. It's amazing. How does God provide? 3 principles. Progression over regression. Consecration over reservation. Lastly, number 3, approachable over unreachable. Approachable over unreachable. Now, like I said earlier, we know the end of the story. We have the scriptures. This story has been around for thousands of years. We know it's going to happen. And what we know is that God gets personally involved. He's speaking to Abraham. And what God does is he provides a ram to be sacrificed in place of Isaac. He gets personally involved and he provides for their needs. And God's still doing that for us today, by the way. God goes all in and he personally provides for Abraham and Isaac. God doesn't stay on the sidelines just hoping that they'll figure it out if I give them long enough, or they won't, whatever, I don't care. But that's what we kind of think about with God, right? But that's not how he operates. Verse 14 says this, so Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide, Jehovah Jireh. And to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. The Lord does not leave them to just figure it out for themselves, like maybe an uninterested parent might. God personally involves himself in their story. And what we're reminded here is that God continues throughout human history to get down into the mess with us and help us. Now, it would be a shame if we missed the prophetical foreshadowing of Jesus in this story. But it's too obvious and it's too important for us to overlook. Let me explain what I mean. In Abraham, you see, he represents the loving father who willingly gives up his beloved Son to die for the sinful, rebellious world. And so as Abraham was willing to give up his son, so God willingly does give up his son, Jesus, to die for the world. And then we have Isaac. And Isaac represents the willing son. Isaac was not forced to die as a sacrifice, but he willingly became a sacrifice. And so Isaac points to Jesus, who willingly submitted to the Father's plan to redeem the world. And the ram in the thicket represents a substitutionary sacrifice. As the ram took the place of Isaac on that altar, so the Lord Jesus takes our place. And he dies a death on a cross that we deserve. So how does God provide? Well, he's an approachable redeemer. He gives up his only son to provide for our redemption and restoration. We so often think of God as this distant God, but he's not a distant God. Old Testament and New Testament, he's not a distant God. He is the God who provides his dearly loved Son so that through faith in the Lord Jesus, we can become sons and daughters of God. I want to share with you sort of a silly story that happened to me this last week. I found myself infuriated sometime this week when I was trying to get a hold of a particular organization to get some information of mine that was listed on their website incorrectly. It was causing some problems. And so I try to get a hold of this organization, and their website's terrible. There's no way at all to call somebody, no phone number, there's no form, nothing at all, no way to get a hold of them. So I spent like 2 hours trying to get a hold of this organization, still never got a hold of anybody, and the problem is still not corrected. And maybe you've experienced something like this before where you're trying to call customer service and you're furious at some point because you just keep saying, representative, representative, representative. It drives me nuts. You can't get a hold of a real person. And then it's great when you have the opposite experience and you do get a hold of a person and you're like, man, this company's awesome. After 10 minutes, I got to talk to somebody. Our standards have lowered, haven't they? Well, at any rate, I found myself so frustrated because this organization, and it's a great organization, by the way, but their customer service is terrible. So frustrating when an organization takes that inaccessible approach to customer service when you need some help and there's nobody else that can help you. So frustrating. But our God is not unreachable. He's not inaccessible. He is approachable. He is accessible. And he's so accessible that he sent his son to die on a cross so that he could be accessible for you and for me, regardless of what you've done. He personally involved himself by paying the penalty, the ultimate price, so that all people who turn to him in faith could have fellowship with the living God. That is good news. And if we miss that in the story of Abraham and Isaac, man, we miss it. We're going to close out the service a little bit differently today. David's going to join me here on stage, and we're going to have one more song today, and we're going to close out the service with communion today. Now, the story of Abraham being willing to sacrifice his son Isaac is a fitting reminder for us of what we are remembering in communion. For God offered up his only son, Jesus, to die on a cross so that we can have fellowship with him. In communion, the bread represents the body of Jesus, and his body was broken for us. The juice represents the blood that Jesus shed on the cross, and his blood is sufficient to pay the penalty for our sins. As David plays this next song, I just want to invite you, if you'd like to participate in communion, you can go to one of the 3 communion stations. There's 2 in the back, there's 1 up front here. And you can grab a cup of juice and a piece of bread. You can go back to your seat. If you want to kneel up front and receive communion, you can certainly do that. But if you want to just do that at your seat, you can bring it back to your seat. And during that next song, whenever you are ready, you can receive the elements of communion on your own, just between you and the Lord. You don't have to be a member of Connections Church to receive communion here. We just ask that you be in a right relationship with God. Now, communion is such a powerful and reflective moment for us, always. And so in light of Abraham's story, I want to just put out there a few questions, reflective questions, for you to kind of think about. And maybe one of these will stick out to you more than the rest. And if that's the case, I would encourage you to just kind of press into that in prayer as we receive communion. Here's the first one. How is God wanting you to progress in your faith? Second, are you consecrating all of yourself to him, or are you holding something back from him? And lastly, have you trusted in Jesus as your Lord and Savior? As we receive communion, perhaps there's something between you and God. You just need to kind of do business with God and get that right with the Lord. For some of you, perhaps you haven't really ever made a decision to truly follow Jesus. Maybe you've kind of liked the idea of following Jesus, but maybe you haven't actually decided to commit yourself to follow him. Well, hey, communion is a great time for you to just pray out to God. Lord, I'm sorry for my sin and unbelief and rebellion, and I'm going to commit to following you. I don't completely understand everything, but I'm going to commit to follow you. You can absolutely take this time to do that as well. So let's take a few moments to receive communion together.